As a warning, this episode discusses suicide. If you need help, call Lifeline on 0800 543 354 or text help to 4357. Kia ora, welcome to this episode in Season 5 of Recovering. I'm Frank Ritchie, minister, chaplain and radio broadcaster. Recovering is a Media Chaplaincy New Zealand podcast highlighting the excellent work of Aotearoa New Zealand journalists. Media Chaplaincy is a team of chaplains around the country offering free, independent and confidential support for media professionals. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with a leading journalist to discuss the story that's had the biggest impact on them both personally and professionally.
As you would expect in a case dealing with the loss of a young life, it was an incredibly sombre atmosphere in the courtroom today.
In this episode, I sat down with Dana Johannsen, sports correspondent for the In-Depth team at RNZ. She was recently named Sports Journalist of the Year at the Voyager Media Awards, with her portfolio being described as setting the standard for all Kiwi sports journalists to follow. Dana's covered everything from the America's Cup and Olympics to investigations and long-form sports journalism. I'm really impressed by her enduring passion for sport, the light, the dark, and the human side of it. In this episode, we talk about Dana's coverage of the story of Olivia Podmore.
This inquest was the first time we heard the true reality of what Podmore experienced, and a lot of those details were incredibly upsetting for the family to learn.
The story highlights Dana's care for the people she's reporting on and her passion for really seeing a story through. We also cover her experiences at the Paris Olympics, writing opinion pieces and being a woman in sports journalism. Dana, thank you so much for taking time to join me. I think, and my producer can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're our first sports journalist.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a great honour.
Yeah, and going through the list of sports journalists, you're right up there. So it is an honour to have you in the mix, especially considering the story that we're going to talk about. I think it captures what goes on in sports journalism that people might not initially think of when they think of sports journalism. Think of sports journalism as reporting on games, etc. Before we dive into that, though, I love hearing people's stories of how they got into journalism. So how did it work for you?
Well, yeah, I think I always loved sports, and so I just decided that I wanted to be a sports journalist. And I was really fortunate that in my first year of uni, I came up to Auckland to do the Bachelor of Communications degree, and within the first couple of months, I landed a job at what was then known as nzoom.com. So I'm not sure if you remember that website. That's the TVNZ, what's now One News. In those days, it was quite separate, and it was quite a big operation, and they had maybe 6 or 7 staff on the sports team there, and I was just a casual. I would go in on the weekends and update the fixtures and standings after each game, and sometimes do a bit of live logging, and sometimes later on I was able to actually write match reports. And we were also responsible for updating teletext.
Oh,
do you remember
wow.
teletext?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so I used to do the same sort of thing, like write the little 3-paragraph stories and update the standings and the leaderboards. And I thought it was the coolest job in the world. I was like, I've made it. Nana can read my stories on teletext.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
Was it a case of I want to be a journalist and sports is the area that I'm going to focus on because I love sports, or was it I love sports and my way of being involved in sports is journalism?
No, I think I wanted to be a journalist from a really early age. Actually, I wanted to be an author, and then my mum, bless her, she's very pragmatic, was like, "Oh, maybe you need something to sort of supplement that." So I wanted to be a journalist, and because I loved writing and reading, and even from the early days at school, like I would faithfully report what I'd seen on the 6 p.m. news the night before. So you'd go and you write your stories, and most people would be like, "We had fish and chips for dinner last night." I would write like 2 or 3 pages about the Swedish backpackers that were murdered. Or
wow.
I did a project when I was 7. Mum loves to tell the story, but I wrote about the AIDS epidemic and
wow.
And even wrote that you can only catch AIDS, because I wanted to do a bit of myth busting. So I wrote that you can only catch AIDS by having unprotected sex. And I didn't know what unprotected sex was, but I put in my little project, and the teacher sort of gave me a nice well done, like marked it, put it in the school library, and you'd see some of the other kids like reading it and like sort of tittering in the background. But yeah, I was very keen to get that message out there.
Wow, clearly journalism was in your bones then. Where did that come from? Did that come from somebody else?
No, not really. I just think I just watched the news. I love reading the newspaper. I just was obsessed with anything like that. It definitely wasn't anyone in my family or anyone in my local area that I knew that did the job. So it was just something I decided I wanted to do.
Clearly a fascination about the world, curiosity, and then watching the news just feeds that.
Yeah.
Also, the reading. I think it's important to make a note here that if you want to be a good writer, reading lots is part of that game. So what sort of stuff were you reading when you were young?
Oh, a lot of Babysitter's Club.
Yeah, fair call.
My grandmother got a giant encyclopedia set, and they were in the lounge, and I would just always go through those and just grab a letter and just start sort of churning through the pages until I found a subject that took my interest or a word that I didn't know or something like that. So yeah, it was definitely a lot of reading.
So a voracious reader. Has that continued?
Yes, not as much as I like to. You sort of get on a good spell of reading and over the holidays or when you've got some time, and then you sort of let it lapse. But yeah, I definitely love mixing both non-fiction and fiction.
Can I ask what you like to read now?
I love reading really good non-fiction journalism. I've just recently read Say Nothing, which is also on Disney, but it was kind of it was Disney that got me into it, but also my friend Ricky Swinnell was a voracious reader, and she will always give me book recommendations. And we were in a bookstore in Melbourne, and she was like, "Oh, this is the best non-fiction book I've ever read." And suddenly there was a crowd around her in this bookstore, and she was like dishing out recommendations left, right, and centre. So yeah, I get a lot of my recommendations from her.
That's really good, and I raise it because it's not come up in any other of our interviews, but I think it's consistent across most journalists. Lots of reading, curious about the world, want to know more, and so feeding their mind all the time. I think if you want to be successful in anything that involves writing or conveying ideas, you've got to be a reader. So it's really good to hear. Yeah,
really good also if you do a lot of writing to see different structures and different literary devices. I find that really interesting.
Career highlights up to this point, what's there been?
Yeah, I was really lucky. I got a job with the New Zealand Herald when I was quite young. I think I was only 23 or 24 when I got that job, and sort of netball and sailing were my two main rounds, but I sort of had other bits and pieces I delved into as well. And I think when you're a sports reporter on the daily news desk, it's covering those big events. It's the buzz of live sport that is so exciting. And so I was really fortunate to cover 2 America's Cups while I was with the Herald. I went to San Francisco in 2013.
Oh, wow.
And covered.
That was a big one.
It was huge, and unfortunately didn't end well for Team New Zealand, but it was such a buzz when things were going well, and then it sort of dragged on, and then we're like, oh, I'm not sure if we're like where this is heading. But I think I spent about 2 months in San Francisco on the ground, and you kind of feel like a local when you're there for that long. It was so cool. And then 4 years later in Bermuda, and they managed to get the job done. And that was like, I don't think I'd ever get the opportunity to go to Bermuda if it weren't for this role. And it was just amazing being on the ground and witnessing this history. Obviously, Team New Zealand at that point had not won the America's Cup since 2000, so it felt huge and it felt momentous. And then last year, I was lucky enough to go to the Paris Olympics, which that was now with RNZ. And again, it just felt, it was glamour. Like they really dressed the city up, or they made sure that those Olympic Games would show off the crown jewels of the city, and it just felt so amazing. And I had a couple of false starts to get to the Olympics. I was supposed to go in 2016 to Rio. The flights were booked. They were in my Air New Zealand app, and then there was a big fight between Sky and Stuff and NZME. I was with the Herald at that time over accreditation terms, and so we ended up with withdrawing. Both NZME and Stuff withdrew from covering those Olympic Games on the ground, and then when I moved to Stuff, I was also selected like I'm an athlete, to the Tokyo Olympic Games. And then obviously with the pandemic, the media opportunities were going to be quite restricted. You wouldn't have the same access to the athletes, which was obviously what needed to happen and to ensure that those athletes were protected. But it just meant I wouldn't be able to cover those games the way that I would want to. So I ended up making the call to withdraw from those games.
So quite literally third time lucky.
Third time lucky, yes. And yeah, it made me even more grateful for that experience. It was amazing.
Is that what you imagined when you got into sports journalism? That this would be the pinnacle, heading off to things like the Olympic Games, America's Cup, you get into sports journalism because this is the sort of thing that you wanted to do?
Yeah, absolutely. But in those early days, it was just going to a Breakers game or going to a live netball game. That was really exciting for me. Like I never thought I'd get the opportunity to go to an America's Cup. Like I thought that just seemed massive and huge. And so to go there was pretty amazing. And then obviously the Olympics is a pinnacle, and I really wanted to cover games and not just be there to cover the results, but kind of cover those outside stories and those human stories as well. So once I got into it, I kind of saw new possibilities and new things to aim for.
Usually when people get into a role, there are surprises. There are things that you didn't imagine. What has surprised you? What did you not see coming?
Ooh, I think I was quite lucky in that I kind of was able to progress in quite a stepped manner. So just getting that opportunity to work at Enzoom when I was 17 when I started that job.
Yeah,
and so
young.
I saw people around me, going off to media sessions and coming back with tape and then filing an angle. So I was able to observe what the job was quite young, and while I was busy updating the standings. So I think I was quite prepared for what the job would be when I actually properly stepped into the media industry. I think what changed for me was I landed my dream job when I was 23 or 24, working on the Herald sports desk. And I didn't think for a long time what's next. And it wasn't until after I got back from the America's Cup in 2017, and a couple of things shifted over that time, where I was like, what is next? Like how, because it got to the point, I'd been there 10 years at that point in time. And I think you could sometimes just put a note in your calendar for what stories you'd be covering at different times of the year, or what issues would crop up. Like with netball, it felt like the perennial issue was, why are our New Zealand teams always losing to Australia? And I would write that story over and over again. And same, even with America's Cup, which is quite a dynamic environment, and there's always interesting intrigue and fights going on. Even that came to be quite repetitive in a sense. And also during that year, I'd kind of got the opportunity. I'd written probably my first big long form piece, which was called The River People, on the world of extreme kayaking, essentially. It was centred around an extreme kayaker, a woman named Louise Jull, who tragically died in the Kaituna River in a kayaking accident, and it sort of followed her boyfriend, who was there on that trip with her, was there when she died, kind of getting back into the sport and continuing his passion for the sport. So that was a lot of work, and I did it with one of the video journalists, Nick Reed, who he kind of brought me on. Like he knew Ryan quite well, and he brought me on to cover this. And that was when I was like, wow, like I really want to do more of this sort of stuff. And I think that's what prompted me to think where I could take things. And at that time, Stuff were launching a new team called the National Correspondents. And I just sort of tentatively emailed the bosses going, I'm not sure if you'd consider a sports journalist for this role, but I feel like I could do some really good stuff. I think there's a lot of issues in sport that aren't going covered because you get so caught up in the daily churn, and your weeks would be structured around previewing the big game, covering the big game, reviewing the big game, and you got very stuck, and it didn't give you a lot of opportunity to just take a step back and look at those bigger issues. And I thought I could see a lot that was going on that I didn't have the time to kind of delve into. So, and yeah, fortunately they were like, yes, we'd love to have you. So I moved across to Stuff, which felt like a really big call at the time, but it was absolutely the best thing for me.
And an interesting space to get into. So this is where sports journalism really interests me.
Yeah.
Because you've got the reporting on games, But it's a human thing, and humans are going to have light, dark, shadow. There's going to be a lot that plays out. So it's this sort of journalism where you start to be able to dive into social issues through the lens of sport that I think it becomes really, really fascinating and really, really relatable. But a lot of people might not think of that as sports journalism, which takes us, I think, into the main story that we're going to talk about. And I'm sure many people are familiar with Olivia Podmore's story, but do you want to just kind of give an overview of the story first?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the story or when it kind of most people became conscious of this was it began with a tragedy. It began with Olivia Podmore tragically taking her own life, and that was in August 2021. It was less than 24 hours after the closing ceremony of the Tokyo Olympics, which she was not selected for. So basically all of New Zealand was still, in this reflected glow of those Tokyo Games, which were at that time our most successful Olympics yet. And it was almost immediately we saw the kind of flip side of that equation, the dark side of sport emerge. And I guess it was that thrust it into the spotlight, but really the story began maybe 3 years prior when a whole lot of issues were emerging within Cycling New Zealand. And I should point out that original story was broken by Abby Wilson at TVNZ, who's an absolute queen, and she led the way with that reporting. She revealed some quite concerning things that were going on within the Cycling New Zealand high-performance environment. And her reporting really led to the Heron report. And I think the first line of the Mike Heron review was something like, the allegations that emerged in the media recently are well-founded, which is like a chef's kiss of a line for any journalist. You're like, so at that point in time,
that is worth pointing out because that would be a huge relief for any journalist because you're taking
100%.
Something that the public often holds as quite precious. We get very precious about our sports and the sports that we love and our sports teams, our sports personalities, our coaches. So when you're coming out with allegations, you're putting yourself in the firing line of all of that love and all of that adoration. So to have an independent investigation validate it has to be a massive relief.
Yeah, it was huge. And particularly when sports organisations go to ground and you don't often hear their point of view other than what they put out in a statement, to actually say, yes, this is actually what has been going on, was hugely validating. Also at that point in time, there were a number of other reviews into individual sporting environments happening. There was a big one into New Zealand hockey, a big one into football, and then alongside that, there were even wider reviews going on into the New Zealand's high-performance environments and looking at some of the issues that were emerging within the athlete welfare space and how the funding strategy and that policy piece were impacting on the lives of athletes. So I was quite new to stuff at that time, and I didn't actually look at a lot of what was going on in those individual environments, and that was more because I wasn't in the sport team. I'd moved into the national correspondence team, and I was still quite new in the role, and I'm finding my feet in the organisation and not wanting to kind of step on any toes of those sports reporters. So I was kind of more looking at those over that big kind of policy piece and looking at funding and selection strategy and that sort of thing, and how bad policy and bad process can impact on athletes. So to bring it back to Olivia, when she died in 2021, it just felt so shocking because it had been a lot of what I had been writing about. I've been listening to athlete representatives warn us that this is what could happen, that some of the mental health impacts on athletes are so severe, like we are at risk of losing someone. And even though I'd heard those warnings and believed them to a degree, I still felt that there's a safety net there. These athletes are well looked after in those environments and people genuinely care. The staff at High Performance Sport genuinely care about their athletes. So I just didn't think it could happen. And so when it did, I was just so desperate to understand what had gone on in that environment, and that's really what kicked things off.
For those who might not be familiar with what had gone on for Olivia, can you explain?
Sure. So she was selected into that high-performance environment, that Cycling New Zealand's elite team, when she was very young. She went up there she was just 17 when she landed in Cambridge in that high-performance environment. And the following year, she was selected for the Olympics. She went to Rio as part of the women's sprint squad. And what it would later emerge is that in one of those lead-up camps to the Olympic Games in Bordeaux, she had inadvertently exposed an inappropriate relationship that was occurring between a coach and an athlete. And it really was an innocent mistake. Her teammate had gone out for the night and hadn't returned, and so she had reported this teammate missing. And when, the search parties were launched and they would discover that she was with the coach, and they were seen later kissing in the lobby of the hotel. So it sprung from there, and you're a young athlete away on your first big tour, Olympic Games, thrown into the mix. So she was put under pressure to lie about what she'd seen, and her teammates felt quite threatened that potentially this could disrupt their whole campaign, and so she was facing a lot of pressure from those athletes as well as other coaching staff and leaders of the organisation. And then she was also being severely bullied by the coach because he felt that she had exposed what was going on. And a lot of it did not emerge until, we're talking later into the coroner's inquiry, but the stories that emerged were that she was, even just minutes from taking the start line at her first Olympic Games, her coach was taunting her and tormenting her. Yeah. And everyone thought, once you get back from the Olympics, this will be resolved, because the things that had gone on were so shocking and so far out the gate of what you'd expect in a professional sporting environment that surely leadership would deal with that. But the changes just didn't happen, and she was forced to kind of muddle on through in that environment, and that kind of toxic environment where she was kind of facing bullying from not only the coach but her teammates as well, who just wanted to kind of maintain the status quo, and kind of, it's all learned behaviour, right? You reflect what your leaders are doing. And so, yeah, she was the kind of target for all of that for 2 years, until finally it just got to the point where she was like, I need to say something. And so she did. She stepped forward and became a whistleblower, and that's when the reporting started to emerge at the same time in 2018, and that would lead to the Heron inquiry, which did find that there were athletes and even staff members in that building that had gone through what was described as sinister and distressing examples of bullying. At that time, there were no names used. It was only after Olivia died that journalists knew at the time, but we didn't name her. But once she died, we were able to link the two.
Yeah, really sad to hear too that she'd gone and talked to support staff about what was going on for her, and that information just made its way back to the coach, which just shows the networks that were in play. It's extremely sad.
Huge power imbalances.
Yeah. Another person that interests me in the story is the ex-wife of the coach. And reading one of your latest stories, her reflecting on her relationship with the person who was working in there, trying to affect change, but then her understanding of Olivia too before she met Olivia, because her information was being filtered through her husband, thinking Olivia was just some crazy young lady, which plays into stereotypes about men and women as well, and young women in particular. And then to see her opinion of that shift once she had the opportunity to sit down with Olivia and hear her story.
Yeah. I find that quite fascinating, and it's those kind of shifting perspectives, isn't it? That when all your information is filtered through one source, and then suddenly, it's like an alternative reality is presented to you. So yeah, like, she was amazing, Nicole Bailey. She ended up waiving name suppression, and the other really instrumental person in this was Jess Massey, the team manager, who had been, like, even long before what happened in Bordeaux, had been trying to raise the alarm about sort of a lack of accountability, some of the unprofessional things that were occurring in the environment, some of the unsafe things that were happening in the environment. And the other thing that really hit home in doing all this reporting was sitting in that coronial inquest and hearing from the independent expert witness, Dr. Eric Monasterio, who's a forensic psychiatrist. And he said, it's well known in science. The science shows that whistleblowers ultimately don't do well. And as a journalist, you kind of sit there thinking, that's not helpful to probably put out there, because, sometimes we rely on whistleblowers. We rely on people speaking up to expose what's going on. But also it really hit home the potential impacts it has on those people who are putting themselves on the line. Yeah, like even though what they were saying was correct, and we've had two independent inquiries that have shown that have essentially validated their concerns in those environments, but they're still always seen as having sinister motivations for speaking up. And I just think, why can't we just judge what, look into the facts of what they're saying, not why they might be saying it? Because I always think with the Larry Nassar case, I think of Rachel Den Hollander, who was one of the first women to kind of speak out publicly about what had been going on, the horrific sexual abuse that he had been a part of for decades in that sport. Like when she spoke up, she was accused of having political motivations, because at that time Larry Nassar was going for quite a senior role. I think it was like head of the school district in Michigan. And she was like, well, that may have motivated me to speak up, because I don't want this man to be in charge of a school district and have this powerful role, knowing what he does to young children. But still people, assign these kind of sinister motivations to her, rather than going, actually, we need to stop this from happening.
Yeah, they've got the good guy in their head. That good guy, he might have done something a bit bad, but if your motivation is bad, that's worse. But the motivation doesn't matter. If a wrong has occurred, a wrong has occurred. What does that do for you as a journalist who wants to tell a story? Someone has the potential to come to you, but knowing that they could be the person who comes off worse off if their name gets out. How does that affect how you treat possible leakers or whistleblowers?
Yeah, it is really challenging. And I mean, you've always done your utmost to protect your sources. Like, that is kind of like a key tenet of investigative journalism. But it definitely makes you even more aware of the potential outcomes, and kind of talking that through, which you always do. You don't want to expose anyone, you don't want to get them in trouble, you don't want them to have negative impacts, but it just kind of means I now talk through that side a bit more and talk through ways to protect them, and just even to the point where they might put me on to someone else to talk to. And I'll always say to that person, I'm not going to tell this person that we've spoken. If you want to tell them that we've spoken, that's fine. But as far as I'm concerned, you're two separate people, and I think it's best if we don't share information. But it definitely, sitting in court hearing that, you do think, I don't want to make people's lives worse. There's
a big duty of care in place there. Dana, it's one thing to tell a story like Olivia's, and Olivia's is a very tragic story. It's another thing to go home at night and to process that story. So what's the impact been on you of telling that story?
Yeah, I think firstly when it happened, I had actually been away a lot in the month prior to it happening. My mum had been really unwell, and I think it was my first week back at work where I was like, right, I've really got to, start picking up all these stories that I've kind of let go by the wayside because I've been focused on family and my mum. And so, it was that kind of first Monday when I was back in the office, and that evening the news started to filter through, and I was kind of like, can I handle this? I wasn't sure if I could. And then I spoke to quite a few people that night, and obviously people were still shell-shocked and devastated and deeply upset. And those same sort of themes that I've been reporting on for the 3 years prior started to come up, and I really felt that I could add some nuance to it and show the sporting context to it. So, I went off down to Cambridge the next day, and I just remember, and I hadn't committed to kind of covering, I was just sort of helping out for that day. And I remember kind of like looking out, we had a stand-up upstairs in the velodrome, and you can look through down onto the velodrome and the cycling track. And I remember just looking down there, and I don't know why, and I just had this really anxious feeling, and I remember thinking, she must have hated this place. Like, that down there is the scene of her torment for so many years, and that's kind of, and I just, but it made me physically ill, and that to think that. And so so it was hard to cover it, but I also thought I had to, in a sense, and that's why I kept going. The other really difficult part was later that month, we went into lockdown in Auckland. We had another, I think that was when Delta was emerging, and that was that really long lockdown in Auckland where it carried on right through to the end of the year. So when I was contacting Olivia's parents and talking to them, I was shut in my house, having those really hard conversations
That's got to
with
be
them.
hard, because usually, surely, that's the sort of interview where you would aim to sit down with someone face to face, which just carries so much more ability to express and experience emotion.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think we did do it over Zoom, and her parents were just so amazing to deal with, and her entire family were amazing to deal with. And so I'd kind of checked in at it quite early on just to see where they were at and whether they wanted to talk publicly. And so I think they had got a sense from me that I wasn't willing, I didn't want to rush them, I just wanted to give them time. And so when we did finally kind of chat over Zoom, we had a lot of conversations over the phone, and they kind of knew what sort of person I was. I think I talked to them for over an hour and a half, probably that first time. And I remember getting off the phone or of the chat, and I was shivering. I didn't realise that whole time, the temperature in my house had gone down. I didn't have any heating on, and I was physically shaking. But I was just so caught up in what they were saying. And I think at that point in time I was like, yeah, I need to stick with this. I need to keep going, even though it's hard. So, it definitely had an impact. And again, just sitting through the coronial inquest, which began late last year, and that we just wrapped up the second part in April. And that again, because I thought I had a good handle on what Olivia had been through and experienced. And even when that first Heron report came out in 2018 prior to her death, I remember thinking at that time, wow, this is an explosive document. We had not seen a review like that in sport before. And so to kind of then go into the inquest process and hear there were so many other aspects to this, and just the actual reality of what she experienced, because bullying can be quite a nebulous concept. When we talk about bullying, it can be anything from saying your shirt's ugly. I don't know why that's the first example I thought of. Don't read too much into it.
My t-shirt's okay.
It can be anything from just an insult to that really intimidation, manipulative, withholding support,
yes,
silent treatment, that sort of really insidious behaviour. And at the time when these issues were first arising and it was reported, sometimes it was willfully misinterpreted by the public and even some sports commentators as it being at that lower end, it just being a case of these silly young women who, they don't really know what sport's about, and, you've got to have...
got to harden up like the men.
Yeah. And because a lot of them came from the generation where you bleed for the jersey, and you just have to tolerate it. And it clearly wasn't that. And so to actually hear the actual human experiences behind those words in a report was pretty eye-opening and so heartbreaking. There were a couple of gut punch moments during that coronial inquiry, and one of them was Nicole Bailey giving her evidence of, finally sharing the story of Olivia being tormented minutes before she was going to take the start line on what was the biggest race of her career. And she's facing fire from her own teammates. It was just horrific. So those were the times when you really had to check in with yourself and remind yourself you're there to do a job and report on this inquiry, and kind of leave the emotion aside until later.
Two questions out of that, because this is the stuff that really fascinates me as a chaplain who sits down with people when they're going through some of this stuff. You talked about being in the velodrome there, looking down and feeling physically ill. When you have an experience like that in your body, how do you deal with that? Do you just allow it to pass in its own time? Do you have some way of responding to that sort of feeling when it's there in your body?
At that particular time, I didn't really have time to go through breathing techniques or find a quiet space because, we're about to do a media stand-up. So it was more just kind of snapping back into job mode and needing to ask the right questions and, then race off to the next thing. So then and there, no, but I think I've got better at recognising when I'm not coping in general and just knowing what to do, like knowing when to check in with myself, knowing when you're overwhelmed with things. And often the first clue is your physical environment.
Yes.
I was just saying this to someone, like, you're not really nailing life when you get home and there's a pile of dishes in the sink and there's 3 loads of washing that need to be done and a wet load in the machine and your bed's not made. And that's when I'm like, you need some order. If you bring order to your physical environment, I feel like that's when you can start to calm yourself a bit more. It seems like a really weird thing, but it helps me so much. If I get home from a really busy day and my house is a mess, and the first thing you want to do is binge something on telly, I actually have to be like, no, you'll feel much better if you actually deal with this mess, this chaos.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good because we can often think of these things as a battle of the mind. So I just need to think my way through it well, as opposed to the response is usually in our body somehow. So finding a way to respond to that by taking action is extremely healthy. Even your mention there of not having time for it, but breathing techniques or finding a quiet place, those are really good. The other thing I want to ask about then is sleep. So you come out of an interview with people like Olivia's parents. For me, that would play on my mind all night long. I'd be replaying that, thinking it through. What does sleep look like for you when you've had a moment like that?
Yeah, not great. Yeah, I'm not a good sleeper anyway at the best of times. And I think, and also because that was, as I say, during a lockdown when your mind was working in overdrive anyway about all the different things. And so, yeah, I think definitely that interview played on my mind and thinking about some of the things that were taken, and then it's like, well, who do I need to go to? Who next? How do I get the story out? How do I tell it in a compassionate way, but also try to stack up a few things that they're saying? And also, I think that was the first time that they'd spoken to media. I think I was the first journalist they'd spoken to on the record publicly, and wanting to do right by them, like knowing that you've been given this great privilege, and being like, I don't want them to put them off journalists for life, basically. So all those things were running through my mind, alongside just the awful things that Olivia experienced.
What's it done for your view of sport, seeing the darker side of the whole thing?
I have to say it does make you a bit cynical. I mean, it hasn't made me hate sport because I went to the Olympic Games last year and absolutely loved it, and I still love celebrating people's achievements and being there for those historic moments. But it does make you aware that there is kind of this other undercurrent going on. And that doesn't take away from what people have achieved. And those two things can be true. Like we look at what that cycling team achieved in Paris. It was phenomenal. 5 medals. They were our most medalled sport at those Olympic Games. And Elise Andrews made history. Like I think before those games, we'd only ever had one woman Olympic medalist. That was Sarah Ulmer back in Athens. And so they'd just broken so much new ground. But you can't help but think that some of that was achieved because of what the sport had been through over the previous cycle, and that Olivia died on day one of that Paris Olympic cycle. Like they were all still packing their bags from Tokyo and at the airport when that news was filtering through. So on one hand, it's incredible what that team were able to achieve and the changes that Cycling New Zealand, to their credit, did put in place to allow them to achieve it. But on the other hand, it doesn't erase what happened, so you just have to allow those two things to sit alongside each other. Yeah,
I think that goes with so many issues, holding contradictory truths together. Two things can be true. It is good to win medals, and then what happened there was bad.
Yeah.
Those things can be held together. How do you remind yourself, though, that truth, beauty and goodness is still there in the world when you're encountering things like that?
It's actually not hard when you get out into the field and and talk to athletes and talk to people on the ground as well. Like there's a lot of great coaches, there's a lot of great administrators, there's a lot of great support staff that care deeply. Like a lot of the people involved in this story are not bad people. There are some bad guys. But genuinely, a lot of them had good intentions, but it's more a reflection of how the system can operate and challenging some of the value systems that underpin the decision making is where things went awry. So I don't think like there's this intrinsic darkness in sport. And yeah, I think probably the great thing about covering sport is that there is an inherent balance built into the job, because on one hand you could be writing about the issue, like, you're writing about governance issues in New Zealand rugby, and then at the end of the week you're writing about a great All Blacks victory, and you probably get that balance in a way you don't get in other rounds. Like if you think about if you're always reporting on the healthcare system and the issues occurring there, you're not often writing stories about Mrs. Jones in Otaki who's just had a hip operation and things went well and she's reported having a much better quality of life afterwards. You don't get to write those stories, whereas in sport you do. So yeah, definitely last year was the ultimate example in that. I got to go to Paris, cover the Olympic Games, and it wasn't even just the medals that were won over there. Like I just think of Eliza McCartney, like such a joyful human being, and her coming back into the Olympic arena after all the injury struggles that she's been through. Those types of stories keep you really motivated and to see the bright side of sport versus some of the other ugly stuff that goes on.
There's another part that we talked about off air that I'd love to dive into here with you, because when you're at the Herald, you did opinion columns. That's not something that you do anymore. What was that experience like, writing opinion columns as a sports journalist and as a woman?
Yeah, like initially I thought it was a great privilege to be asked to write a weekly column. Like I really felt like I'd made it at that point in time. But I found it really challenging in that I don't always think that, like, to be wedded to this kind of weekly schedule of writing a column. Like Monday was my column day, so I'd have to come up with something. It was some days you're kind of scratching around for things to write about, and actually, like, you might not have felt that strongly about it, but the column writing or opinion writing demands you take a position on something, and so you do. But I could have easily been, if I got into a debate with someone, could have easily be convinced of the opposite of what I was writing and changed my mind 5 minutes later. But you kind of go down the track of being really wedded to that opinion. And yeah, certainly because I brought a different perspective. I was obviously very passionate about women's sport and just trying to highlight some of the sexism and misogyny that goes on in sport. It just obviously brought out a lot of keyboard warriors, and yeah, it got to the point where I would dread coming to work that day, and your anxiety would start the night before, just worrying about how that column was going to land. And sometimes, like, I felt good when I didn't get a response, which because I'd breathe a sigh of release when I got in and my email wasn't flooded. I'd be like, okay, good. But on reflection, that probably wasn't a good thing, because it meant like it didn't really resonate with anyone, or it didn't, you kind of want to
spark a reaction.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of realised that I didn't think it was a good thing for me, more from a personal perspective than a career perspective. Yeah.
You reflected earlier when we were off air that writing an opinion column has the ability to affect your telling of stories and people talking to you. Could you talk me through that a little? Yeah,
that was the other side of thing, is that sometimes it's not helpful when you're reporting on certain issues to nail your colours to the mast, in a sense, because then when you do try to kind of do some more reporting on that down the track, people might see you as being really wedded to this opinion, or that they think, oh, you're the feminist, you're not going to give us a fair go, or you've got strong views on this, so we're never going to be able to get our point of view across in this piece, when that's not actually the case. And I think often, even to the point where people will bring up a column you wrote 4 or 5 years ago as evidence that clearly that's how you feel. But people have the ability to change their mind on things, and people have the right to change their minds on things, and your perspective shifts over time. Like I think back to what I was writing when I was covering netball early on, and I remember writing a lot about, because New Zealand was struggling competitively, about how Netball New Zealand needed to like firm up its pathways and get 12-year-old girls into these like really elite high performance programs to assure that there was this pipeline of talent coming through, because that's what they did in Australia. They're a really competitive state system, and clearly that's why we're falling behind. But having now done a lot of stories on the youth sports space and secondary school sport, I realise that's totally contradictory to what all the evidence shows. But yeah, at that point in time, that was not my view, of course, but there were definitely a lot of people expressing that view, and we didn't hear the counter-argument that actually that's kind of a bad thing, and you'll lose a lot of talent that way rather than promote talent. So yeah, absolutely. Mindsets shift over time, and people like to point out when you've contradicted yourself from
Yes.
from 4 or 5 years prior. So yeah, you're always held accountable for what you say.
Yeah, and then one column can cement something and how people think about you forever.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
That's hard. Can I, and I'm making some assumptions, can I ask what it has been like being a woman reporting in sport, which is so often male-dominated? I mean, you pointed out people being dismissive about you being feminist or misogynistic or whatever. I don't actually know what it's like in New Zealand to be a woman in sports, but I look overseas and I see how some people are treated, and it can be horrific, not taken seriously. What has it been like?
Yeah, I think everyone wants to hear the horror stories, and there are a few, but I think, and I can tell you some, but I think by and large, like, I've never felt alone. Like, I came into the industry at a time where there were a lot of women sports journalists. Like, all the Metro, the Daily Metro newspapers had a woman on their sports desk, like from Southland Times up to the far north. There were a lot of women around at that time, and obviously I came into the Herald following in the footsteps of Suzanne McFadden and Julie Ash. There were people like Monica Holt, and looking on TV, Michelle Pickles, Ricky Swinell was one of my contemporaries, and she was the same age as me, but I was like so awe-inspired by her because you just knew from day one that she was going to change the face of the industry. So I never felt like I was special or that I was alone in doing this, because the trail had been blazed well before I arrived on the scene. And alongside that, like, I worked with a lot of really great mentors. Dylan Cleaver is one who was like hugely supportive of me from day one, and like, he was a legend already. And I remember one time, like, he came across to the Herald. He'd been working for the Herald on Sunday, and in those days we were quite separate. And I remember getting a text one day that just said, "Your story should have been the lead today." And I was like, "Oh,
awesome.
Thank you." Yeah. And so he was like just supportive in a very quiet way. There was definitely times where I'm like, that you shouldn't say that, or, that's poor behaviour. But by and large, I just felt really well supported and really lucky to come through at the time I did. And I think as particularly newsrooms have shrunk, but sports desks have disappeared. Like 5 or 6 years ago, they got rid of all the regional sports desks. We've seen Radio Sport close. We've seen the closure of News Hub. And so as those sports roles have shrunk, women journalists have probably been the one that have felt it more. So yeah, I worry for those ones coming through now that they don't have a lot of role models around.
Well, the fact that the best up-and-coming journalist was won by a young female sports journalist, I think, is fabulous, and her work is great as well. Yeah,
Bonnie's really impressive, and she was also a finalist in Sports Journalist of the Year as well.
Yeah. And again, another great example of someone diving into sports journalism, but highlighting some social issues through the lens of sports journalism that just makes it relate way beyond just who won a game, which I think is fabulous. Can I ask, just because I think it's healthy for journalists to hear this stuff, what does downtime look like for you?
I have a falling down house that I do a lot of DIY on. So, yeah, a lot of downtime is spent painting and scraping, sanding, a lot of that sort of stuff. Gardening, not gardening, more yard work, more pulling out weeds. Yeah, and I'm big into exercise as well. I love going to the gym, love getting out, walking. I'm really fortunate I live next door to some really good friends of mine, and we have what we call Family Walk Fridays, and so we go for a walk on Friday mornings with their 2 dogs, and we just kind of banter about the week and kind of it's almost like a debrief on a Friday morning, and it's become a bit of a tradition that probably started during COVID, but I find that really healthy as well.
I'm a big fan of those dedicated traditions that take place at the same time every single week. Turns it into a rhythm. You know it's going to be there. It becomes a safe place. And the beauty of DIY work is you have to be really present to it. Otherwise, you're going to do yourself some damage. So you can't spend all your time thinking about these other things.
You need a good eye for detail when you're doing all that paint work, that's for sure.
Can I ask you in closing, Dana, what you think the future of journalism in Aotearoa New Zealand looks like?
Yeah, you've called me on an optimistic day, but there are definitely, it's been hugely unsettling the last couple of years, and there are days where you do kind of despair about the future.
So give me your less optimistic view if I was asking you this at a different time, and then give me your more optimistic view.
Okay. Well, I should preface it by saying, I'm always, hugely optimistic because I know the talent that's out there in the industry, and I know how good, particularly our sports journalists are. But I do worry about the impact that technology is having on our industry with AI and people sort of speeding off in that direction without fully understanding the implications of it, or the not so much the implications, but the drawbacks or restrictions of that technology. And
can I just say on that, in sports journalism, AI, I could see it taking over in terms of giving an analysis of a game. So just download the transcript of the commentary, spit out an analysis.
Yeah.
But in terms of what went on for Olivia, I just can't see how AI can take that space. Yeah,
and I think that's probably what makes me a bit more optimistic, in that AI can't stand in front of somebody and ask them questions or describe the scene of what's going on. You still need people to do that, and you might be able to download the transcription of your interview and it would spit out a passable story. But I think to properly understand the nuance and the context, you do need humans to tell those stories. And I also am optimistic because I was reflecting recently with a friend in that I've been at, those big media organisations, both of them long enough to see the strategy almost do a full revolution. When I started at Stuff, for instance, they were going big in the direction of investigative journalism and doing that kind of value-add stuff that you can't get elsewhere, you can't find on social media, and really going down that line of investing in journalism. And then you kind of saw it shift, and they've gone back towards being more about numbers on their website. And same with the Herald, you've seen their strategy do a full revolution as well. They're now pivoting back to video. I was there when they were pivoting to video for the first time. So I think there will come a time where news bosses will again see the value of deep analytical journalism, investigative journalism, and human stories told by humans. Yeah, AI can't do a lot of things in that space.
So the optimistic part of you sees journalism reaching deeper into that human aspect of the whole thing.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. I want to close by saying thank you. This is a word that's already come up with the interviews we've recorded for this season so far, but I want to thank you for your courage. I want to thank you for your care. I think it's come out there in terms of how you treat the people who are facing the darker side of sport and need to be able to tell their story. Olivia has left behind a family and friends, and having read some of the stories you've written, there's a care there that is fully respectful of them. So thank you for your care, thank you for your interest in human beings and for telling the stories of human beings.
Thank you for having me.
Ngā mihi nui, Dana. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me. Thanks to Radio New Zealand for hosting this series, and thanks to you for giving some of your precious time to listen. And again, if you need help, call Lifeline on 0800 543 354 or text help to 4357. A big shout out to Mallory Carey and Josh Couch for producing this episode of Recovering. If you appreciate this podcast, please give us a 5-star rating and share it with someone else who would like it. And remember to follow in your favourite app to catch future episodes. At Media Chaplaincy New Zealand, we value our media. We demonstrate this by offering free, independent and confidential support for media professionals. With a solid and caring team in various parts of the country, we're here to help. So if you work in the media industry and you want to chat to someone who's there to listen, head to mediachaplaincy.nz to arrange a catch-up, and the coffee's on us.